The world is a tricky place at the moment. The last 5 or 6 years have been characterized by a growing realization that the world has never really recovered from the global financial crisis of 2008 that marked the end of that glorious kind of 20-year period of peace dividend or of rapid globalization that we saw after the end of the Cold War. What we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is then an acceleration of some of the challenges that we had. And obviously that began with the pandemic, which led to a unprecedented scope of government response around the world in terms of the fiscal and monetary policy adjustments that they made. We then came out of the pandemic to find that we were now confronted with some very significant supply chain issues as kind of lessons that had been that we had beforehand, or the methods of operation that we had beforehand had sort of been forgotten. There had been frictions. There was grit that got into the system over the course of the pandemic. So we came out of that, and then just when we maybe were starting to feel that that was starting to settle down a little bit, we had the horrible events this year with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the resultant challenges that has presented, not least of which has been the weaponization of energy supplies to Europe in that. So, tricky times, in fact beyond tricky, very difficult times, possibly the most difficult we've faced in a generation. But rather than dwelling kind of just too much on how difficult all of this is, let's sort of break this down and think about 3 significant transitions that we're going through at the moment. The first is the place that transition gets used most commonly, which is the energy transition that we're going through as we move from a very carbon fossil fuel based economy to one that is based more around renewables. That's an ongoing transition, and we're going to talk about that a little more as we discuss these matters. The second transition is that of one from a essentially stable, globalizing post-Cold War world that was somewhat unipolar, based around a US leadership of the world. That has broken down very dramatically and kind of very transparently during 2022. We see rising tensions between the US and China. We see the obvious conflicts going on based on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we basically see a world in which globalization can no longer be taken for granted, in which friendshoring or reshoring, as it sometimes gets called, is a very important consideration for companies around the world. And the third transition that we're seeing is that of one from a very benign, central bank supported capital market environment to one in which, in many respects, normality is being resumed. Capital is no longer effectively costless, and that this is having some very stark implications for companies and investment direction around the world as we speak today. So if we go back to the notion of these 3 transitions, we have, if you like, we have some different timescales that apply to each of these 3 transitions, and they each have very different implications for the challenges that they present to suppliers and companies around the world. If we think about the green transition, the energy transition, that's really, although we're all convinced that the need for action here is urgent, that is a transition that is going to be measured in decades. Realistic, even the targets that get set, the zero emission targets that get set, are measured in targets of 2050, 2060. We need to understand that with all the best will in the world, that is going to be, those are transitions that is going to take place over the coming decades. The second transition, that of kind of this geopolitical transition from a very stable world based around a globalizing economy under broad leadership of the United States, that's a transition that is taking place kind of real time and based on, if you like, almost like that's going to be measured in years, that transition. So companies need to target immediately how they source out of friendlier or more localized markets. They need to think about alternative sources of energy that take away those things. And if you like, it's rather than being measured in decades, that one's measured in years. The third one is this change of the monetary and fiscal environment, and in particular what that means for inflation and interest rates. And that, quite frankly, is measured in weeks, months, and if at the longest period, quarters. The changes that we've seen this year are dramatic there. They have very stark implications for the provision of capital and the cost of finance for working capital arrangements around the world. And that is where, if you like, the sharpest end of these transitions are taking place. Very interesting. I think it's important here to have the right degree of modesty about what supply chain finance can do. Because if we're modest about it, we can set targets for it that will be achievable. And if we take, again, back to these three transitions, the first one, the energy transition, measured in decades, the importance of supply chain finance there will be around providing companies over the long term with the degree of capital and resources that they need to be able to support them. But day to day, the provision of supply chain finance is not making the greatest difference to what is happening in that transition. The geopolitical transition that we see, their supply chain finance can make a very significant contribution by helping companies deliver liquidity to those new suppliers that they need to have in more localized markets as they friend or reshore their activities. Those companies that they're going to be now stressing in order to have greater deliveries to them are going to need the liquidity and the capital in order to expand their activities, in order to meet the requirements. Very important role that supply chain finance can play there. But the third transition, that of towards a far less benign monetary and capital environment, is one in which supply chain finance plays the most immediate role. It is absolutely clear now that supply chain finance can play a critical role in the delivery of liquidity into an environment in which capital is no longer being provided for free under a central bank sponsored set of monetary policies, but rather now is based around a normalizing world of capital allocation. Standard supply chain finance is kind of well understood and provides some fairly obvious answers, particularly to the latter two of these questions. It's delivering liquidity to suppliers based on the, if you like, the lowest cost element of their supply chain, which is the buyer, who generally speaking will be the lowest cost credit in the chain. But that doesn't get you very far, or it creates as many risks and challenges as it is solving for. Orbian has worked extremely hard to solve three very important challenges that exist that need to be addressed. The first thing is the provision of liquidity from the broadest array of sources, and very importantly, with the separation of suppliers from funding sources, so that no supplier is ever exposed to a single source of financing, with the attendant risk that goes with the fact that that source may no longer be available to them. So it has to be broad, it has to be based around a very broad distribution of the funding sources. That's the first thing. We've been doing that for many, many years, and that's well established. The second thing, critical this year, has been our card products that have enabled us to enroll suppliers of every shape and size in jurisdictions all around the world, so that as people in particular are seeking to address the needs of their reshoring activities, suppliers that, regardless of size or scale, can be brought on board to the supply chain finance programs and have the benefit of the early liquidity that is being made available. And the third thing, and frankly, in 2022, the single most important contribution that Orbian has made has been the provision of fixed interest rate supply chain finance arrangements that have allowed suppliers to be protected from the shock of interest rates having been raised so dramatic, not since 1971 has there been this kind of policy responses that we've seen in the marketplace. It has devastated the cost of finance for suppliers around the world, and Orbian alone has worked in order to provide suppliers with immunization, insurance policies against those rises in interest rates.